You're in the hands of an adolescent.
It's mystery. I don't like mysteries. Your bellyache. I gotta kill you right now.
Aye, sir.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. With me as always, my good buddy Lord Uther, and joining us today, Jack Burton. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thanks
Good
for
to
having
have you. Good to have you. I don't have a huge lead in today because I think we're going to have a lot to talk about. This is episode 7. This is Star Trek 7, my personal favorite, Generations. Now, I think the reason this movie is, full disclosure, the reason this movie is my favorite is because I had a very short grow-up period watching original series stuff and mostly exclusively watched The Next Generation for most of my childhood. So, formative years were spent with this crew, which is heavily featured in Generations. And I think I first got to know Kirk really from this film. I think this was the first deep dive into Kirk I ever saw. So it's really special to me. I think it's one of the finest Star Trek films. I don't think that's even really up for debate. I think most people find this to be one of the best. So I'll be shocked to hear if there's anything. But I mean, just picking up where we left off, Star Trek 6 to Star Trek 7, we are following arguably the best original series movie outside of Wrath of Khan. So there's a lot to live up to with Generations. Now, as a mirror to that, Next Generation at this point is like reaching a fever pitch of popularity, a wave that it's going to ride for a good long while. Not to mention you've got Deep Space Nine and Voyager. I think they both started around the same time that this movie came out. So there's kind of a lot going on here. Let's just jump into this opening sequence, right? The whole opening portion with Kirk on the Enterprise B with what's his nuts captain, where everything's coming on Tuesday.
That's right.
This is like a fiasco of an opening. I mean, what did you guys think of this? I mean, I loved it, but.
Well, I'll turn it over to Jack there in a second, but I somehow got my hands on the original script, and I don't know how that wound up happening. And interesting. Anyway, and if I remember correctly, and I'm sure Mr. Burton will be able to correct me on this. Wasn't it originally supposed to have Spock in it? I thought that was part of the original plan.
So, I mean, I don't want to steal away from your thoughts here, but the original plan was to have 3 of the original crew in this, little 10-minute prologue to set the stage for Generations, and obviously the producers were hoping it would be the big 3. It would be Captain Kirk, his science officer Spock, and Dr. McCoy. Now, Leonard Nimoy, the actor and director and producer and at times even uncredited writer, he had opinions, and he did not want to appear in this picture without more input, I guess. You have to remember that the first, at least episodes or chapters or whatever, 2 through 6 of the original Star Trek films, basically Harve Bennett was the driving force. He was the producer, he was the writer, he was the guy calling the shots. Actually, mostly 2 through 5. By 6, they kind of kissed him goodbye. But he was a big creative voice there, and we had transitioned now with Generations over to the TV side, and Rick Berman, who had been producing since Encounter at Farpoint. He had 179 episodes under his belt. He kind of knew what a Next Generation film should look like, should sound like, should smell like. So there was a little bit of creative tension, I guess, between Leonard Nimoy and Rick Berman and his team. And so the original plan was to have those three. And when you see the opening, you could clearly see how they could have made that work, with those three veterans on the bridge, etc. But again, Nimoy said, I want to work on the script. There's some things I have issues with, and they just said, no, we're probably not going to do that. DeForest Kelley, ever the gentleman, said, I think we said a pretty good goodbye in part 6. So he gracefully and bowed out. So the parts, as you say, the original script was sort of a wish, boy, wouldn't it be great to get those three on. They adjusted the rules for Chekhov and Scotty to appear. And honestly, I mean, as a fan, you don't really, it's not as if it takes away from the picture, but we can get into more of that later as we get to the end of Kirk's journey in terms of how that's settled. But that was basically the setup is Nimoy just, I think, or, maybe he just wanted more money, because Paramount has always been famous on trying to keep the budget. They know how much money they can make on these things, and it's when they start spending more than that audience return will get there if it gets them into trouble. So, but anyways, your thought on the opening.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because the banter is there. I mean, Scotty's ribbing Kirk a little bit, like something wrong with your chair, Captain, right?
Something wrong with your chair, Captain.
Yeah, right. That's going on.
Unbelievably great.
Yeah, I mean, Chekhov is doing his typical vessel kind of thing, and then we meet Sulu's daughter, and there's really no discussion about what happens to Sulu. So I always found that kind of interesting too. I did like the comment that there should always be. It was something along the lines of, either the ship's in good hands because there's a Sulu at the helm, or something along that thought process. The other thing I really did appreciate too was that Kirk still wanted that chair. He going through all his motions, get the camera out of my face, all these things, like he still wanted that chair. And that was something that to me just seemed a natural thing, right? That he would want that. And I think the other thing we see too, obviously, is they've aged again, right? I mean, at this point, Shatner's in I think he's probably around 60, 61, somewhere in there.
That's just as
but he's yeah, that's right, and Scotty's too. But they're still bringing it. I mean, it when I first saw it, it bothered me because I did want the big three, right? But as time has gone on, and I was going to mention that too, watching this now versus last time I'd seen it probably 10 years ago, I don't know, new appreciation for it. So yeah, I think the opening does it some justice. I even think the original opening had Kirk skydiving or something like that, which I have one of the figures from Next Generations, and it's him in a like skydiving spacesuit or something. But true. Again, yeah, I think overall solid opening, and then we never really know what happens with Enterprise B, I believe, afterwards, unless there's some books out there. I think there are some books somewhere. But once Generations is over, we just jump to, Enterprise C was in one of the Generations TV shows.
Enterprise, but I could be wrong.
I think that's right. Well, but I think the opening works, right? And you knew that Kirk wasn't going to be dead when that happened. I mean, at least I knew even the first time I saw it, like, something's up here. I'm not sure what it is, but it's probably going to make it through.
But it was quite the moment, though.
I agree.
I mean, I think the way it unfolds is just perfect. I mean, the way he's passing the torch so reluctantly, and how he's just itching to get back into that captain's role. And then when he's finally got it, he makes the very conscious, not quite painful, almost like freeing decision to say, you know what, no, I'll go take care of it. This is your place. And it's like, wow, I mean, that's a big moment for Kirk. I mean, I think it would have had more impact if you had McCoy and Spock there to react to it. But for Kirk, I mean, I remember being mind blown that he got out of the captain's chair to go, take care of this ensign level problem, let's say. And Because I was expecting it to go quite differently. I was really expecting somehow to see, like a young Picard on the Enterprise be as like a science officer or something. When I first watched this movie many moons ago, which could have been an interesting story, but obviously the age doesn't quite work out there if you know the math.
Yeah.
But I always thought that moment with Scotty and the young captain in this giant hole in the Enterprise, realizing like the gravity of what just happened, and the whole have Chekhov meet me on, what was it, deck 25 or whatever, deck 15, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, that just like the emotional gut punch. I think all of the preceding movies, they kind of tried to punch you in the dick a little bit at some point or another, but this is the first time it really hits hard. The one issue I have with this movie is after this opening sequence, it goes back to that formula of that extremely long credit roll opening. And that to me is the real passing of the torch of this movie, because it wouldn't be a Star Trek film moving from generation to generation if it didn't have some ridiculous opening scene that takes way too long to unfold. And it just like... ugh. So, I still enjoyed it, but...
Go ahead, Jack.
So,
what are your thoughts on that opening scene?
The overall opening, like you said, it was. I was coming to this as a moviegoer first, Star Trek fan perhaps second, because I wanted to see, you're taking an environment that we are familiar with in a box, and we're going to blow that box open and put them up on the big screen. So I was anxious to see, what that visual language, how they would do things differently than you'd see, every Thursday, Friday night on television. And, I mean, you can see right away on the bridge of the Enterprise B, some of the lighting, some of the camera moves, and I note that the cinematographer for this was a feature cinematographer. His name was John A. Alonzo. He'd been working for decades in Hollywood. He shot Roman Polanski's Chinatown. He shot The Bad News Bears. He shot Blue Thunder with Roy Scheider. He shot Scarface, Brian De Palma's Scarface. So you had a Hollywood seasoned cinematographer, and there are moments like when they first encounter the Nexus, the gravimetric tear in the universe. The camera's on Demora, and it starts to do a dolly across, camera right, as Harriman is approaching the bridge, on screen. And it's a very subtle move. It's not reinventing cinema, but it's something that you never would have seen in the television show, because in television, you got to get your scenes and you got to get going and get your commercial break and et cetera, et cetera. But it's the kind of thing you see all the time, on the big screen. And, it's Brian De Palma-ish. And so just seeing that was exciting as a viewer, for that first time or the 40th, to see them embracing the language of film. Now, coincidentally, this whole idea of a rip in the galaxy, and we've got temporal displacement and all of that, that seemed very much like something you would have encountered, and anyone who's watched a lot of Next Generation episodes can attest to this. That sounded like a Next Generation problem. It's very much in that language.
Oh, that's a good point.
And what was fascinating, again, as a viewer to me, was that when we saw the original films, Kirk and Scotty and everybody, they're fighting madmen who are trying to destroy the universe, or they're trying to achieve global, international, interstellar peace. So they had these really larger than life, they're going to go find God at the center of the universe. But here, it was interesting to see them basically in a Next Generation plot. Like, hey, Captain, there's a gravimetric field in front of us. It's in flux. What do we do? And so it was like taking these three characters and putting them sort of on new terrain, new turf. Conversely, when we fast forward 78 years to the Generation crew, now they're the ones stopping a madman, dependent on destroying the universe and so forth, which is not something that Generation was doing, week in and week out. They were a lot of times in television, you have the time and the ability to develop characters, and you have a lot of interpersonal stories. Perhaps Worf, he's trying to raise his son, and Wesley going to fail his Starfleet exams. I mean, a little bit smaller scale, but now we take the next gen crew.
Riker's going to bang a bunch of hot chicks.
Right, exactly. Now we have the next gen crew. Like this is huge. They're going to wipe out entire star. I mean, so it was interesting to take the two casts and kind of inverse them. Where'd you guys go? Oh, there you go.
Right here.
Inverse them and put them in those situations. So, and a final point on Ursa Master. Perhaps the scene that you're saying sets the stage opening. You can pick that apart as you will, but I think the transition from the loss of Kirk presumably over to this stately naval vessel on the sea. The composer for the series for Next Generation did the music for this film, Dennis McCarthy, and it's a wonderful transition. Very it's moving and it's graceful and it's kind of everything that we didn't hear in Cliff Idleman's score for Undiscovered Country. It's very, you get chills when you hear it because you're like, that's what Star Trek sounds like. And here we go, off on this thing, and then suddenly everyone's dressed, like they're in the Pirates of Penzance, and that's a whole other issue. But I thought the score, when the champagne bottle hits Enterprise B, all of that was just classic Trek. And it gets right into your marrow. So.
I'm so happy you brought up the cinematography. So I don't know if this plays into it, but the one thing that I really noticed was the lighting. They really made like a dark tone from the get-go. At least, I mean, every scene on Enterprise D is some light through the window and everything else is dark. And I don't remember seeing that in the series. It just seemed to be this real quick switch, and it
right, because
it just threw me off. But
yeah, in television, you have these sets, and you blast the light on them. It kind of flattens the image because again, you're on the bridge. And here, in this filmic world, when they first walk onto the bridge, when the alerts comes to get to that station. You can see, I mean, like even the bridge itself, they're just subtle differences that they've made to account for the
dark
filmic language. And that's what I'm saying. As a film guy, I'm like, oh, look, it's different. I love this. So.
Yeah, it was a lot different with that. And just one more thing, Urza, I don't mean to be stepping on you here a little bit,
right.
but I want to address the soundtrack because let me tell you why it's one of my favorite soundtracks ever. Yes, the music is great, but here's if you bought the CD. It had all the special effects sounds on it at the end, and I love that. It had phaser sounds going to warp, red alert klaxons going off. It was fantastic. And for a Trekkie like me, I remember getting to the last song or composition, I don't know what you call it there, Jack. But all of a sudden I hear a phaser fire, and I'm like, what is this? And it's all the sound effects from the movie on the CD. So it was just so cool. It was so cool.
Wow, that's awesome. Now I'm thinking I got to go to the UCD store and try and find it.
Yeah,
because that would be dope to have. We could maybe pirate some of that for our intro. Ooh.
Yes, I love it.
I'm sure there's a soundboard out there. I actually was flip-flopping the intro of the film and the transition to the naval ship, so I realized I did that as you guys were talking. I don't know what it is about the champagne bottle sequence. It's always annoyed me because it takes forever, and those long credit rolls have always bothered me in any movie they happen in. The worst is probably 101 Dalmatians, the original animation. It's 7 minutes long. It's ridiculous. And I know because my daughter's watched it 100 times, and I have to skip it to the 7-minute mark. Otherwise, she loses interest and she wanders off. And I always felt the same way about the Star Trek movies, especially original motion picture and Generations. Those two always had those long-ass, drawn-out sequences.
Right.
So it's interesting, the flip-flop of stories, though. I hadn't thought of that. And now that I picture that, I see an interesting flip-flop as well, is the darkness really starts with Kirk's disappearance. Like, everything up till that point is just kind of jolly and fun, but sort of melancholy, but not really dark. It's like there's some hope in it. this is like Kirk's last hurrah. Is this a heroic just ending for him? And now he transitioned. Well, then Picard, goes through this very jolly moment of, performing the ceremony for Worf, and then the hilarity that ensues, and Data being Data, and then he gets obviously terrible news. You kind of feel like the whole time it's like, well, wait a minute, why did they go from such a dismal kind of hero's death to this sort of jovial, ha ha ha, we're having fun on this naval battleship? And all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, they flipped the switch. They're drawing a parallel story here, which I found very interesting. Although it's, I think, comparatively much heavier hitting than just the simple death of Kirk. And I think that's why they give Kirk a different ending, a different death. Because, I mean, to all intents and purposes, he's dead for the Next Generation crew. And has been for, 78, 87 years of flip-flop. Yeah. So it's a death story and then like a redemption death story. But, I mean, we'll get into that later on in the movie. But, of course, you've got, these 40 or so passengers, and 47 out of 150. And Tully and Soren and Guinan are both on that ship that they save. You see Guinan, I don't know, I marked out. I was definitely like a little schoolgirl, like, there's Whoopi Goldberg. Like, I am ready for some Next Gen. But Tully and Soren, first of all, I named my son Soren after this character, so this is how much I love this movie. Don't tell my wife. But
well, that's
she liked the name too, so it's not my fault. But I don't think there's a better villain actor, or ever has been. And I'm going to put this out there. He's number one. Malcolm McDowell is by far the best villain actor I think I've ever seen. And any role he plays, he's fantastic, villain or no villain. And this is probably the most intimidating next-gen villain I think that we've seen to this point in the series. Because I don't consider Q a villain. The Cardassians, whatever. I'm trying to even think if there's even a comparable villain in Next Generation. So I'm looking at this as the first like big ass challenge that Picard has ever had to face. And you sort of know very early on in this sequence, or in this transitional phase, when they find Soren on the space station, that's like, okay, first of all, he's the bad guy because he just friggin' looks like a bad guy. But like, he's on a new level. He is on, and he has these powerful quotes he uses to Picard, kind of like the Shakespeare quotes in Star Trek VI. So many parallels there. It's like, okay, they have blown up this larger-than-life villain, and Picard's in this fragile emotional state. He's a deep Shakespearean character in a lot of ways. How is he going to react to Soren? Like, how is he going to be able to face this down? And it sets up this confrontation that I think you can't resolve without Kirk. Are you guys seeing it kind of the same way I did, or what do you guys think about that perspective?
I think when we see McDowell, again, this is sort of like we had in the last picture, where all of a sudden we're getting actors that we are familiar with. Your head goes back to Clockwork Orange or Blue Thunder or anything that, time after time, anything that he's done. So it helps fill in some gaps in our head, just minor, like, okay, I kind of know what to expect from this guy. And just like Christopher Plummer did, he undersells. I don't want to hear Malcolm McDowell, screeching and screaming. He does it all, with a very, they say time is the fire in which we burn. That's just as chilling as anything there. It's kind of funny. I don't want to see the villain yell in this movie. I want to see Picard yell, because nobody does like Kurt better. When he's like, telling Riker, to begin the investigation. Just do it. I go to these Next Gen movies just wanting Patrick Stewart to yell at somebody, like to raise his voice 3 decibels in that perfect accent. You are a Starfleet officer. You have a duty. That's where the money shots are for me there. But yes, I love the fact that, and again, thinking motivation, right? You want, you don't want a villain to just be a villain for the sake of villainry and all that. So what was Khan? Marooned, bitterness towards Kirk and so forth, vengeance from here to the end of the universe. Soren, I mean, all this stuff as his machinations unfold and we see what exactly he's up to. I mean, he's not Thanos. He's not out to make some sort of universal point. That's just a means to an end so that he can achieve what he wants, which is to be reunited with the family or the life that was ripped from him, prior to, these Elorian refugees and so forth. And I mean, he got a taste of it, as you'll see later in the picture. He got a taste of paradise, or a taste of this otherworldly dimension that he could evolve in. And he's just laser focused on that. He doesn't care if it's going to wipe out Viridian 3, Viridian 4, whatever. This, for him, he's got to get back inside the Nexus. And so, to some degree, even though he's the villain and even though he's a formidable force, like, you can at least see the chemistry and what's going on under, behind him. And maybe you can't, justify it, but you can understand. He's just a driven man, and he just wants what was taken from him and get out of his way.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a Patrick Stewart, Brent Spiner, Malcolm McDowell film. I think we get to see Brent Spiner really cut his teeth here. I think his acting was just superb, doing all the emotional pieces, which I'm sure we'll get to some of them. And again, Jack, great point about Picard, because we see him, he's pretty angry throughout the whole film, like just pissed at life, understandably so, right? But we are getting that very curt Picard, like you said, barking out those orders or just being mad. And we're not used to that, right? He's typically, not that he's really like this huggy-feely type of guy, but he's usually level-headed, keeps an even keel, and he can't control it, which is interesting because Data can't control his emotions during this film pretty much either. So we're kind of seeing that from them. Malcolm McDowell, I saw Clockwork Orange eyes when he looked at Geordi, and when he was threatening Geordi. I saw those Malcolm McDowell Clockwork Orange eyes where you're like, oh shit, like to borrow the Brent Spiner line. I mean, you could see the madness in his eyes, and I just thought that was so cool to see that from a great actor and to see it in a Trek film, right? So I really think you see these actors just take it to a new level, in my opinion. And again, Brent Spiner, to me, steals this movie away because we see that emotional side. When he's drinking the drink and she's like, do you want more? And he's like, yes, please, right? He's all like shaken up because he can't stand it. I hate this, it's just... Yeah, I mean, it's just, he does such a great job with it. Yeah, he does such a great job with it. And we get, again, I know it's said a couple times now, but wow, to see Brent Spiner in that role.
Unbelievable, right? I mean, that's the other side to this, and I just thought of this now, because it is kind of amazing how some of these characters really steal scenes. God, there's so many things I want to say, so I don't want to forget any of these points. But the first one I want to say is, what about Riker? Right off the bat, just feels like this second in command.
Yeah.
He feels very like supporting character in a way that, like, on the series to this point, he's been huge, a very big focal point, and continues to be. And his his relationships and Worf and Troy, like, they are very much supporting cast in this movie, which is not usual for the series. So that, I think, is very interesting. And then in scenes where you kind of expect Riker to sort of be taking command like he does on the show when he's running the ship, Data comes in, he gets an order, and celebrates it. Like, I mean... First of all, okay, I quote the Lifeform song.
Yes, you do.
Once or twice a week. Like, it's not like people are very sick of me doing. This has been like 30 years of me doing this at this point. where it's just like, I just love scanning for life forms. I've been making eggs by myself in the kitchen on a Saturday morning. I mean, like, I just love frying life forms. Tiny little life forms. You know, and I've always tried to be able to do, like, the drum part where it's like, and I'm like, I'll never be able to do it. But it's so incredibly Data. But he's also, there's balance to him. He didn't just go balls to the wall with this emotion chip, which I think is just this extreme testament to his acting acumen, is that he also returns to character. And in moments, he's very precise and logical, and that Vulcan fill-in that the show desperately needed, and blows that up to a newfound level, where, you know, when he's working in stellar cartography with Captain Picard, and Picard's having his sort of emotional roller coaster going on, walking behind him, and he's trying to scan, and Data's clearly got something playing out on his face without having anything play out on his face, and then he has an emotional moment and they trade off. That, to me, that whole sequence there is just, I mean, it's outstanding. It is, I think, why, not to flash forward too far, but the whole Picard series, despite the fact that, you know, they did what they did with Brent Spiner in the first season, he's in the second season and is in the third season. They have to have that Picard Data foil. No matter what Brent Spiner's doing, those two actors play so well off of each other. It almost makes me wish that somehow Brent Spiner could have been an X-Men or something like that, just to play off of, I want to call him Jean-Luc Picard, but Patrick Stewart. And I feel like this is that film where you finally see that. Because you get some of the relationship on the show, right? But, again, we're talking small screen to large screen. It's just that much more intense. And I have to think that this is a bit of a gamble, character development-wise, for them in this film, because later films, Nemesis in particular, make this like their central focus in terms of intrapersonal relations between the crew. So, I mean, what do you guys feel like? I think there's a lot of character-to-character interplay in this movie, but I really, like, as much as you have Picard and Kirk, Picard and Soren, you know, I think Data Picard is really kind of the foundation of this movie in terms of the storytelling.
I think as you get to the big film, I mean, and you see this with the original six, I mean, the core, the big three, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, would usually be where you were going to, you know, balance your compass. And if you had some nice business for Chekhov in 2, he got, you know, possessed by an earworm, and you know, we talked about Uhura, you know, dancing amongst the sand dunes. I mean, there was always little moments for each of the others. You know, Sulu got to be the Excelsior captain in 6, but you know, in a 2-hour narrative, you know, you only have so much real estate that you can, you know, tell your story and do it. And I think the calculation by Rick Berman and the team and the writers, and I don't think it was a wrong calculation, was, you know, Brett Spiner is Data as an audience, you know, surrogate, sort of a childlike, you know, going along with these amazing adventures and experiencing that. You know, Picard as your Shakespearean, you know, nothing's going to get to me. I will lead my crew, you know, to safety. Like they, as you say, gamble. They identified that core relationship there as how they wanted all the films to kind of, you know, sort through. And, you know, you can go through each one of them. Those two get the prominent storylines. Those two get the most interactions, if you will. And everybody else is expected to kind of just pick up the slack, whether it's Riker or Troy or, I mean, Dr. Crusher. I mean, they just, you know, that's just how these films have always been. It's very hard to do fan, you know, to be able to service the characters, you know, unless you have a 2.5 hour, 3 hour picture. So, you know, I think that's just part of the gig, is that you're only going to see Counselor Troy. So what is her scene? You know, her big scene is early on with Picard trying to process the grief he's going through. So she gets a nice moment there. Later on, when the battle's going, I mean, see, they do their best, right? I mean, Worf gets a promotion, and then he comes up with the plan to, you know, get them out of a jam later in the picture. So it's not as if they get ignored, but yeah, when it comes to feeling anything, making those connections, like, what are we supposed to feel in this picture? I think Patrick Stewart and Brett Spiner, just they're the guys leading the parade, and everybody else, like I say, just fills in admirably sort of behind them. And on television, you can give Riker an episode. You can give him a season-long arc. I mean, you have that ability to do that. But this one, you have such limited runway to take off and land that, and you got to keep the story moving, So that scene in Stellar Cartography, I mean, maybe that, could have been, you could have had Riker in there, right? But now you've got, you got 3 different voices in the room and so forth. And they said, no, let's just keep it, Data's running the controls and Picard's figuring it out. And then, so that's how I saw it. That's just the nature of the beast.
I muted myself, my bad. Going back to Spiner, because this is something that Jack had said to me when we were talking about Jim Carrey being in why am I drawing a blank? Being having that serious side to him.
Truman Show.
What? Yeah, Truman Show. Spiner, I think Stellar Cartography is a very important scene because we see Brent Spiner. Like, I think any actor can do funny, but the great actors can really do serious and pull it off. And that was the point that you had made to me about Jim Carrey. And it was when we were watching Dumb and Dumber. We were watching it, and you go, the scene where he like gets all verklempt and he's all upset, right? And you go, that's why he's going to be great in Truman Show, because somehow I had read that script too. I don't know how that had happened before it came out. But you go, that's why Jim Carrey, like, that's why he's going to get this role. And we kind of see it again with Spiner having those moments of being scared or upset. I can't do my duty anymore. And then, Patrick Stewart steps up and tells him, well, you're a Starfleet officer, you got to perform your duties. So I think that's all important and encompassing to where this movie's going to wind up going.
I think it's interesting, too, and I don't know why I didn't see this before, but thinking of that relationship between him and Data, I think back to the Farpoint mission. I think it's in the Farpoint episode where Picard is like, I can't believe there's families on the Enterprise. I don't like kids. Keep the kids away from me.
Yeah.
He's a father figure to Data in a lot of ways, as much as they're best buddies. And it really comes through here and sort of the firm hand of the parenting, like being a parent now, especially, like, I know even when you're going through some shit emotionally yourself, you still have to stand up and be firm and be a parent. Like, you don't get the luxury, and he's a captain. He's not just like a parent to the crew, but especially to the childlike figure, Data, who's experiencing the world really for the first time with emotions. And Picard has to, despite his not caring for children, he has to stand up and be a parent figure. And he's not, he's lost his sort of surrogate son, his nephew, and his uncle, and his brother. And, now he's feeling the weight of, like, nobody's going to be able to carry on the Picard family name. But in a way, he is getting to be a parent. He's getting to play sort of that role that he's not going to get. And I think that's a very, very, very subtle plot point, too, is that despite the fact that he doesn't have a biological child, he's sort of got this adoptive entity that, really in a lot of ways he's raising now, because like a toddler, I think of my kids, they have a super hard time dealing with any emotion, whether it's being really happy, the yes, or being really scared, like, oh shit, or, being like so scared you're frozen and can't move. I mean, I've seen my daughter do that. God forbid a bug crawls in front of her outside, but it's like those incredible moments now, and I mean, it's just dawning on me now, it's such a special film because it's so layered and nuanced. Again, I don't know that I get that from the previous 6 movies. I think it's a little more on the nose. And this one, like Next Generation, which I hate to say it, but I do prefer Next Generation to the original series, it just, there's so much more to it. It's so much more complex. and while I love Roddenberry's original vision, I think it was always destined to be that way. It was destined to take on greater stories and personal connections, and this movie really kind of ignites a massive fire. And we're not even really too far into the story here at this point, because we haven't even talked about the Klingons. Again, relegated to just sort of a cameo position, although it sets up one of the most entertaining space battles, but it's definitely like a tertiary moment in the film. The whole, Riker's fire, which is the coolest fucking line Riker's delivered ever to this point. And it's just badass. Like, it sets him up as a badass in a way that Kirk really was. He's a young Kirk in this movie.
He's totally Kirk. I've always said he was the Kirk character, right? I mean, he even says fire like Kirk would say it. And that's why I think that pair up of him with Picard has always kind of been there, right?
Is that like a callback to the best of both worlds? Mr. Worf, fire. I mean, is that what we're supposed to get from that? I mean, it just, like I say, it just feels like a nice little echo there. Like, in case you missed the end of season 3, here we go.
Yeah.
Let me interject really quick before we get into the space battles and further into the Nexus there. We talked about the special effects in 6, how ILM had saved us from the disastrous rear screen projections in number 5. This film was almost split straight down the middle. The opening with the Enterprise B and all of that was ILM and doing model work, and there were some later scenes, individual moments where ILM was doing it, but a lot of the Enterprise D shots, going to warp, some of the space battle that you guys were just referencing, that was from the TV vendors, and was one of the first. This seems impossible to believe now in the wake of Avatar, The Way of Water, but some of the first all CGI effects used, for that purpose. And the one thing that I bring up at this moment is that I think there was this familiarity, especially with fans of the show, like, okay, we know what the Enterprise looks like. We spent 7 years going in and out of the quarters. I didn't get those beauty shots that I was singing about before in the previous episode. Like, all the shots of the Enterprise D in here are very much like we're entering orbit over a planet, or we're, you don't get those graceful, like, long looks, like, and for someone who's coming into this kind of cold, it's almost hard to kind of visualize the geography of it at first. Now later, when, when things go south, you get a little bit more of that feel. But I was the one thing I wanted more of. I'm like, just give me some, some special effects beauty shots of the D, because it's a great looking ship. And I forgot what class of starship that was, but I mean, the
Galaxy class, I think.
Galaxy class.
Galaxy.
Exactly right. Like, it's such a great looking ship, and it's different enough from Enterprise NC.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so I like I say, that's the one thing. Near the end of this, I'll tell you my theory as to why they did it that way. But early on, the first shot of it, I think, is when it's approaching the Amargosa, station, and it's just a quick shot of it, like, coming into camera, and then, gone. And it's like, oh, there's the Enterprise. So that's my only little quibble there, is that give me more shots of the ship.
It's funny you say that, because I actually thought it was stock footage they were using when they were warping out, because it's the same bank and then warp out.
Right.
And so when I was watching it on the Dreadmill the other day, I'm like, man, I think that's stock a couple scenes seem to be right from the TV show. I didn't know those were actually actual special effects that they built in. So that's interesting.
That's interesting.
I didn't know that.
I think part of the reason they did it that way is they're kind of masking the scale and scope of the Enterprise in a way, which they do on the TV show purposely, because then they can build a million different sets, and it's like, oh, this is just another part of the ship, and it's like, well, how the fuck, like, how are there this many rooms on this ship?
Where was stellar cartography?
How big is this ship?
Right?
Yeah. I don't think you see stellar cartography before this movie.
It's like a four-story IMAX.
In Next Generation. Yeah, it's yeah. So I mean, it's I think it's somewhat intentional, and that's why the TV vendors were kind of perfect for that sort of portion of the effects in this movie. Although I do see the stock footage kind of point too, because I always thought that about the saucer section, like they just reversed from Farpoint the whole docking sequence. And I was just like, well, wait a minute. Is this just backwards? But
right.
with a little touch up. But what's mind blowing is I think of the computer systems at the time, right? With the CGI graphic, even with those like $30,000 or $50,000 computers built for just doing that kind of animation, back in the day, like a lot of the CGI in that era was garbage. It was a half step up from money for nothing. So it's amazing to see what they could put together with the limited technology of the time. And honestly, it makes some of the CGI graphics that we get today look like shit too, because it's like computers are way more powerful now. Why can't we make something that looks convincing? I would look at Avatar and point a very large foam finger at it and say, why does this look like shit most of the time? That's my take. I haven't seen Way of Water yet, and I probably will never. But sorry, I really don't care for Avatar. But I think it's because it's trying to be sci-fi and it's not Star Trek or Star Wars, so I kind of get a little
You
snippy.
struggle with that? Yeah.
I do. I really do, unless it's, like Firefly was one that like I could get behind because it was very much in the same vein.
Yeah.
But when you're trying to do space and another planet and you make it like military, I don't know. I have problems, but I should revisit it because I've only seen it like twice and it's been 15 years, so I'll give it a fair shake. I won't shit too much on James Cameron, who we all know that James Cameron does what James Cameron does because James Cameron is James Cameron. But I'm just full of these South Park references this week.
You are.
And I know for a fact my wife is not going to get that reference when she watches this. I don't mean to derail us, but I want to take a second and just say that, this particular movie for me is really the pinnacle of Star Trek films. And if I was making art
Yes.
or producing something and I needed a website built,
Yes.
I wanted to show off my talent or my store, but I don't know how to build websites. I took web design in 2005 and I have not done jack with it since.
Right.
Lord Uther, who would I go to build my website?
I'm going to tell you right now, first of all, you're not going to ILM. You don't want anything to do with that. You're going to the Peak. You are going to Peak Media, where Michelle easily takes that George Lucas fella, pushes him off to the side, pushes that ILM off to the side, and she just rises to the peak to provide you, yes, you, our faithful listeners, with the best website possible. You need a merch cart? Done. You need beautiful graphics? Done. You need some business consulting? Done again. So if you want the peak, if you want the very best web design, you're going to Michelle at Peak Media, and you are not going to ILM. It's very straightforward.
And that is peakmds.co, Peak Media. Our own website, digitалescapepod.com.
Yes.
Peak Media production, which we love. Michelle's great to work with. I was watching this the other day, and I was going to watch a portion of it tonight before the show just because I fucking love it. But I didn't want to come down and dig out the DVD. And I don't have it on Blu-ray. I realized that like all of the movies that I should have on Blu-ray, this is like number one. I have I'm looking at the DVD right now, staring me in the face, right next to my big Phil Collins poster, and it's like, the hell are you doing? Buy me on Blu-ray. Retire this DVD to your shelf forever. The VHS tape, it's in the cabinet right in front of me. I know it's in there. I have a laser disc of Star Trek 4, but it's right over there. But I was thinking about it like I couldn't find it. I don't remember what platform I was watching it on, but like I was like, F it, I'm not going to bother. And I love the fact that you can stream stuff now and you can watch from basically anywhere. But when I'm on my elliptical, to turn and look at my TV, I have to turn like this. But there's a little, like, I don't know, 36 to maybe 40-inch space on the wall dead ahead of me. Boy, if I could hang something there. But I wouldn't want to hang it there always because it seems like a waste of a spot for a TV. You know what would be really cool? Is if I could take that off the wall
Yes.
and repurpose it later.
Yes.
Perhaps in some sort of fashion like a gaming table. Lord Uther, do you have any suggestions for me?
Well, without a doubt, Patrick Johnson over at Sanctuary Woodworking would set you up not just with this beautiful tabletop gaming experience that you can have, but it doubles as a TV. You could put it up in your wall right there in front of you on your Dreadmill. So as you're doing that, and then when you're ready for that D&D session, you're going to bring that sucker down in this really, really beautiful encased woodworking box that is put together, and then you're going to start pulling up all these animated maps, and you are going to have the grooviest, the best D&D session you could ever ask for. And then when you're done, what are you doing? You're not putting it off to the side. You're not leaving it on your table. Urza Master, you're putting it right back up on your wall so you can keep watching your Generations movie while you're on that treadmill or on that elliptical. Whatever, rowing machine, free weights, it doesn't matter. We just put it up on the wall. You're good to go. You take it down. You're good to go. Either way.
Fantastic.
You're good to go.
That's the best thing I could ever think of. I have to go out to sanctuarywoodworking.com and check them out and get my hands on one of them because, boy, howdy, that sounds lovely.
Yes, Gary.
Speaking of lovely, getting back to our lovely Deanna Troi and our lovely Dr. Beverly Crusher.
Yes.
Interesting part of this movie. Again, we get back to sort of the way they had to relegate some of these big personalities to supporting roles. I've always felt that it's a disservice to Star Trek fans to kind of leave the distance between Deanna and Will Riker. And in this movie, there's very much a cold shoulder going on there, despite the crisis scenario they're in. And I know she sort of has to play the counselor for the captain who's just gone through some shit. And there's all this other stuff going on. And of course, Data's dealing with his thing and all that. But I always thought it was kind of unusual that like a Betazoid. Jeez, is it late or what?
Who took the NyQuil, me or you? But anyway, go ahead. You're doing great.
I always thought it was interesting that like she is supposedly like the counselor for this entire ship and anybody who comes on it, but can't read the intentions of this Elorian, Soren. She can't like feel the heat coming off Will Riker in this movie. Like there's so much like subtext between these characters that is carrying over from the show whether they wanted it or not. And I've always craved just one little scene between those two, Riker and Troi, just something cheeky or something, like mildly sexual, because I feel like that's a bit of a little point of comedy that a couple parts of this movie I feel like were needed from other characters. Like you get some relief from Data, but you also realize he's struggling. He's not just funny for the sake of being funny.
Right.
A lot of it's just him literally not being able to cope with the overwhelming emotion. And you get, some wisecracks here or there, but like there's some of that storytelling of character between these supporting role folks that really feels like it's missing. I don't think it's a weakness to the film. Again, you've only got a couple hours to work with. There's so much territory you can cover and so much you can't. But, a turn of a phrase, a little minute interaction I feel would have been huge. And then Crusher. I mean, where's Beverly in this movie? Like, it's especially with Picard going through ostensibly the worst thing he could possibly experience. Where's the doctor? Where is her counseling the captain that we see in the show all the time? And of course, with Picard and the Nexus, that sort of pulls that possibility out. He's on the planet basically most of the show. But, it's just something that, like, while they're still in that vein, there was possibility there. And I always felt that was a little bit, it left me feeling wanting more. I think the best movies always give you that feeling, but for me, it was something I felt that they could have just sprinkled that in. I don't know, you guys, having read the original script, was there anything like that was on the cutting room floor early on in the film, or anything they didn't speak to that they wanted to?
No, I think they made that course correction, and if you know your Star Trek Next Gen films, exactly what you're alluding to gets touched on, and in some cases foregrounded in the later films. I think they saw it as a missed opportunity here. Really, I mean, besides rejiggering the opening to have the original cast members who those were going to be, the only other major cut, and it wasn't like a major cut, but there was an extended torture sequence with Soren and Geordi, and it involved putting nanoprobes under his skin, and kind of doing this mock alien sequence where it doesn't burst out of his skin, but it's moving around underneath his. And it was harrowing, and this was the last Star Trek film to be rated PG, and I think they were cognizant of that, so they cut that sequence. If you watch the film, he talks about, he kind of leans in for the torture, and then we cut away, I think, to Stellar Cartography or Crusher or somebody doing a scene. But there was, in the original script, there was a 2 or 3 page, basically like, make Geordi hurt, which again, he doesn't give Soren what he's looking for, but it's just an excuse to torture LeVar Burton. But no, I think the writers.
Hollywood loves to torture LeVar Burton.
There you go.
Yeah.
I think after this picture had come out, they said we need to address. I mean, in lots of different ways with the supporting cast, but I think the Riker-Troy relationship was one that they're like, oh, we just missed that. And part of that, I think, was this balance of trying to pass the baton, make sure we have enough time with Kirk. And I mean, I just think there were just some things they just didn't think were going to, be able to, that it would, topple the plates and they'd all shatter on the floor. So I think I think that was probably their calculation, and I think they knew that and then addressed it later in the films to come there. I wanted to say, you were mentioning the Klingons, terrific introduction to them. There's a cast member on the bridge, and he's like, "Sir, I have a Klingon bird of prey decloaking off the starboard bow." And he's just, I don't know if they re-recorded his voice or that's what that actor sounded like, but he just always had this standout voice as he's saying that, and Picard's like, "What?" And then we get a great ILM shot of it decloaking, a new shot, not a stock footage of the bird of prey sort of swinging around to the Armagosa station and so forth. And I had not seen the television episodes with these sisters. I had to do my own research later to figure out kind of what their deal was. I don't think as somebody who wasn't aware of their backstory or how they had interacted with the crew before, I felt like they did a great job here shorthanding it for me. I mean, I knew right away kind of, these aren't the main antagonists. They've hooked up with Soren to do their dirty work.
Right.
But I didn't have to have a long backstory and like, well, this is what we've been. I got right away. They did a great job in efficiency in bringing me up to speed, if you will, so that I could just go with it and say, okay, so these are 2 Klingon sisters. They've got this ship, and they're gonna be a problem.
Yeah, I really didn't know the sisters at that point either. I must have missed some of those episodes or something, or missed an episode. So same thing. They did do a really good job of, hey, this is who they are, kind of, and right, it's just another, like a minor foil for the Enterprise. Which brings me, I don't know, I don't know if we want to cross this bridge, but one of my issues with this film, you're gonna, I don't know, Urza, where do you want me to go with this? I can hold off.
No, I want you to go full bore. Go. We're going balls deep into this movie.
How can my Enterprise? Fine, you want to see the shield modulation? Ooh, okay, that's fine. So the first one goes through. You're going to tell me the Enterprise doesn't remodulate right away, and then they can't. I mean, so I struggle with that. Can we stop blowing up Enterprises? I mean, for the love of God. So we had to blow up another Enterprise. You know, I it's kind of like everyone finding out Spider-Man's secret identity or Batman's. I'm so sick of that story. Like, stop blowing up the Enterprise. I feel like it's a cop-out, but it does get us one of my favorite ships ever, which I don't even know. I don't know if you could see in the background over here, but we get the Enterprise E, which is one of my favorite ships. I love that ship. You know, we Kirk. Here's my biggest issue, and you already know this, Urza. He's supposed to die alone, and he should have died on the bridge of the Enterprise by himself. I will. That's my. I can't even speak. It gets me so worked up. He was supposed to die alone, and he doesn't. So the struggle is real, as the youngins would say.
But
go ahead, try. Go ahead
I will
try.
take that. Okay, so we're going back to our rock climbing days here. The whole point is Kirk knows he's going to die alone. No family. He's not leaving a wife behind. And he knows he's safe because he's got his crew with him. In this film, the crew is not with him. No wife, no family. Literally, Picard and Soren are hundreds of feet away. He's alone when he actually gets mortally wounded, and then he dies with Picard right there. But he doesn't know Picard. He knows Picard for like 5 seconds. So I would say that, in a way, he does die alone. Everybody he's ever known is gone, except for Spock, which he doesn't know that, so it doesn't matter. So I will say that I think I get where you're coming from. Dying on the bridge of the Enterprise, saving his crew potentially against the Klingons or something would be poetic and sweet. But I do think it still works. Now, I also think we should point out that, you know, we've jumped ahead to the end of the movie, but
We did, my bad.
and that's okay. You know, this is the Warp Core. There's no rules here. I do think what they did in Shatner's book really brought a little bit of a nice ring to it. You know, kind of brought it back to where it needed to be. We don't need to go into that because at some point we're going to have to like invest in all the tertiary materials so we can do episodes on that. We've only got like 900 episodes of Star Trek to cover first, but we'll get there. Hopefully, that's when we'll have the Rogan money and we can afford all the original materials.
That's right.
So hey, if you haven't already, if you're watching this, hit that subscribe button. Helps us out. Drop us a like, drop us a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts on how Lord Uther is totally wrong about this movie. It's perfect and has.
I like the movie.
I'm being facetious in a way.
Right.
But to come back to, I think we pretty much covered the bases we need to cover to get to the Nexus. Like the whole Geordi thing, I agree, was a little convenient. I think the implication there is that when they see the shield modulation, the person probably making that adjustment is Geordi, and they can still see what he's seeing. So my assumption is the reason they keep getting shots in is because they know what he's changing the shields to, and he doesn't know at that point. So that was my feeling on it. But of course they find their. God, I love that moment when they just fucking own, you know, Lursa and
Yes.
that whole shit. Oh, so great. Fire. Fuck. Oh, man, just like your nipples get hard just hearing it. But of course we have Picard alone on the planet trying to save the day. And I've always felt that, like, when I watched it the first time, I thought that was going to be it. That he was going to somehow find a way, get through the shield. Soren shoots at him in the dust. He makes his way up, ends up stopping him. The ship crashes, and he's like, well, you know, this is what happens when I'm not with my ship, you damn kids. Or something to like that effect. But then we get this moment where it's like, oh shit, Picard couldn't get the job done. That's not happened. The captain not saving the day?
Yeah, that's a good point.
And that's, I mean, you want to talk about, okay, yes, they've blown up 1 million Enterprises at this point. huge overstatement, but like, yeah, it seems like a trope in this movie a little bit, but that moment completely balances it for me, where it's like, oh my god, a captain on Star Trek just couldn't save the day. What's next? The Nexus. And then we get this utterly bizarre fantasy world of Jean-Luc Picard, which is like this Victorian Christmas.
Right.
His kids and his nephews there, but notably his brother is not there. And he's got a wife, but we don't know who she is, and it's not Beverly Crusher.
Yes. I'm surprised it wasn't Beverly. Yep.
I'm handing it to you guys. Like, what?
Jack, I'll let you go in just 1 second here, because that's my final point that I had an issue with. He could have gone back to any point in time. He could have saved the Enterprise. And what does he do? Come on, Kirk. I'm going to take us back like 3 seconds before all this, before the missile launches. But that's okay. They just had to get Kirk involved. With that said, I'm done complaining. It's not like we're talking Phantom Menace, where I could rip that thing apart. Dead as pod race. I could do that all day. So I'll hold off on that. But with
we got to do a Star Wars pod. Yeah. I'm down for that. Let's start another podcast.
I'm ready. Let me just throw one more thing before I give it to Jack. Let me tell you what Kirk. Here are Kirk's last words. Are you ready? What his exact last words were? The last 2 words that came out of his mouth. Oh my! Those were his last words. Oh my! And I just think it's hilarious because George Takei says it all the time. Oh my! So.
Is that why they're pissed at each other forever?
That could be. Who knows?
Because he subverted that epitaph.
He set up Takei with Omar.
How perfect was that, though? I'll let Jack go.
Go ahead, Jack.
Okay, 2 major thoughts come to mind here. On destroying the Enterprise, yes. I mean, we've done that a few times. I can see where that was there. I think the plan all along that producer Berman and the writers Ronald D. Moore and Brown and Braga, I think they wanted to have a clean break from television.
Yeah.
And so in a lot of ways,
good point.
Going forward from this, you have a new ship, you have new uniforms, you have a whole new dynamic, per se. I think it was, they took some sort of, I won't call it a sadistic glee, but they were like, okay, good. We're not going to be using these sets anymore. When this thing goes up, I mean, we haven't seen explode. We see guys flying over consoles, jamming their shoulders on the floor and, I mean, this is destruction, on an epic scale. It's kind of like, we're done with this. I think the part that shocked me when Picard fails and it takes it over is, at least for a few moments, you can see the saucer sections come to this crash, and you see the little tiny figures walking along the roof of it, and then they just get wiped out like the opening of Terminator 2.
Yeah.
And you're like, wait, what? They just killed the entire cast? Like, what's going on here? Which then brings us into, like you say, this sort of weird transitory purgatory limbo, if you will. And what jumps out at me at that, again, using Dennis McCarthy's sort of underscore, I love the little, on the tree, the little, the ornaments are all reflecting the explosion of the star, and, the music takes a very sinister tone to it, as if to say, like, be careful what you wish for. And, I mean, I like that even more than Guinan coming in and giving us the exposition that we require in order to traverse to the next sequence, which is, getting Kirk. I mean, if you really, truly, honestly think about it, forget Kirk's death scene or any of that business. This movie was conceived, written, produced, directed, everything around those two meeting in the Nexus. And the contrast in captaining styles, in personality, everything in that entire sequence, that's what this movie, I mean, that's what it exists. Those 4.5, 5 minutes of Kirk basically being like, I'll make some eggs. And, I'm tired of saving the galaxy, kind of a thing. And Picard,
Right.
The voice of reason saying, you have a duty, and don't you dare turn your back on it. And then Kirk, as he takes the jump on the horse, working Shatner's love of Equus.
Got it again. Yeah.
I mean, that, like I say, the picture rises and falls on those moments, and that's the first time in the movie we get Dennis McCarthy's sort of signature theme for this. And in many ways, it sounds a little bit like the DS9 titles that he had composed.
Yeah, that's a great point.
But it's bigger. It's bigger than a television theme, and it kind of, honestly, it doesn't really, it's not an apples to apples comparison, but I'm reminded of what Leonard Rosenman did in Star Trek 4. It's kind of upbeat, and it's not exactly Star Trek, but it fits the vernacular. And like I say, I draw it in sharp contrast to what Cliff Idleman did in the last picture in Undiscovered Country, where he definitely leaned into brooding and martial and military-esque and very dark. And here, this, McCarthy was only one and done. He'd done, most, if not all, of the Next Gen episodes, and he did DS9, so he was busy. But his one contribution to this filmic universe, this score, is a terrific score. And like I say, it comes to full flower here in this scene between the two of them. And it's a great scene, and it should be a great release for the fans, because like I say, here they are, side by side. This is Jim Kirk is exuding all of Jim Kirk. This is who he is, boiled down to a fine essence. And here's Picard, and they both realize they need each other once again to save the universe. And that's, to me, like I say, that's the high point, and it overshadows what later happens to Kirk. Per se, this is the moment. The Kirk death scene, I think, is interesting because I don't feel the emotion. I don't weep. I don't have I recognize the loss, but I think that almost was on purpose. It almost feels like, as you might confront loss in the real world, sometimes it's not so grandeur and orchestrated and choreographed and scripted. Sometimes it's there and suddenly a void and they're gone. And I think they were going for something like that. Emotionally, is it satisfying as a fan? That's debatable. But I think this moment between them at the ranch and jumping over the ravine and coming together, that's the core of this picture emotionally.
Right. I like that. Everything really had to revolve around that. I think that's a fantastic point. I also love the part that you brought up about not feeling emotional. And maybe that's why I'm so torn up about he should have died on the Enterprise. He should have died alone. Because to me, that, Urza and I have talked about this before. He loved that ship. That was his that's his child. That's the kind of love he had for that ship. And that's why I think he should have died that way. And I'm going to draw a parallel to Star Wars. It's like when Luke died. I had zero emotion attached to that. That's not how he should have died. That's a whole nother podcast. When Han Solo died, I loved that. I did feel like part of me was ripped away. I thought that scene was great. So the idea of you had to build the film, and I never thought about this before, so I'm so happy you brought that up, that you had to build the film around the two of them being together, and how are you going to make that happen? I guess there's your purposeful nexus in a sense. That's why that had to be. That's an excellent point.
And a year later, we get Pacino and De Niro in Heat, the same dynamic.
Oh,
this is a year before.
Yeah.
Yes. So.
Wow. Excellent point again.
Yeah. I love the contrast between the two captains, and having watched all of Next Gen, you definitely see a marked change after this film's events in Picard. You see him adapt a little bit of Kirk's style into what he does. I think, is it season 4 where he meets Vash for the first time on Ryza, and he's kind of stiff upper lip, and then, sort of like goes on an adventure, totally on Picard. And there's more like sort of Kirky moments that come from his interaction and having met and teamed up essentially with Kirk. So I think it's there's a lot of torches being passed, but sort of back and forth too, which I think is really special. I also like the point about how Kirk loved the Enterprise kind of above all else, and that was his surrogate family. Because Picard largely is unmoved by the destruction of the Enterprise.
Yeah.
I think he even says in the end of the movie, like, I doubt this will be the last ship to bear the name Enterprise.
Yeah.
But you know who he is concerned about? Data. And again, it's that surrogate child situation for him is like, well, his crew is okay, but really it's more Data, of course, than anything. And he's also, low-key just saved, 160 million people? So, it's just like, the scope feels very small, but you sort of, like, remember the details. It's like, holy shit, he actually just saved, like, a lot of people. How is he not an admiral after this movie? So, there's some little logical things you have to sort of let go. But, but I get back to that moment in the Nexus, like, I know what they're trying to do, but if you're in your own personal heaven, and let's play out our own Nexus situations. If you're in your own personal heaven, are you going to a Victorian Christmas with kids in these little weird costumes where you're blindfolded in a chair? What were they doing?
I don't know.
Getting ready for dinner, but like playing with the kids, like, okay, he's experiencing the family he never had, but like, why would he not go back and, I don't know, maybe bring some milk to douse that black monster that killed Tasha Yar? Or, there's so many other things, like his personal paradise. Why is it not like him, like blowing up Borg cubes or finally getting like push Q off a cliff? There's just so many things. It's just like, it just feels weird. Even for the story, like, why is it not him and Beverly Crusher, and they're in Chateau Picard, and his brother's still alive, his nephew's there, he's holding a baby. Like, why this? It always felt very artificial. Like, they leaned real hard into the stiff upper lip Brit, even though he's supposedly French. I guess if I had any real problem with this movie, it's that part I've always been confused about. And why Christmas of all things? Like, is that the most family-centric time? Not like his kid's birthday or the birth of his kid, or, making his kid. Like, our own personal heavens. Come on. And why just that one little slice? Why is Guinan coming there? Why aren't there other little bits and pieces he gets to experience? Why cut it so short with this dream family?
Yeah, well, I'm going to turn that one over to Jack, but to actually ask Mr. Burton another question, I think Urza brings up a great point about Picard changing into a again, he's not that even keeled. He becomes gruff as the movies kind of go along, a little more stern. Mr. Burton, is that purposeful? Like, do the writers sit down, or the people that produce the Trek films, do they sit down and say, you know what, we're going to change Picard and make him a little more stiff upper lip, or make him a little more gruff or aggressive, or is it just something that kind of happens? Like, are those things planned out? Do you see what I'm asking you?
You're right. Yeah, I think how this worked with the original crew and how it seemingly worked with this crew was that the writers would brainstorm ideas. I think one of the first early ideas was to make this a Borg picture, and then they're like, no, let's save that. Let's not come out of the gate with a big Borg picture. Let's hold that off in reserve. And so they go through their iterations and their suggestions and ideas, and they'll do their drafts. And then, Shatner and Nimoy in particular in the original series, like they would give notes. I mean, just as any high profile actor. I mean, if they don't want to do it, then you're screwed. So they would get the script, and they would be like, nah, Kirk would never say this, or he sounds like a pissed off gym teacher in this scene, and change that. And so then the writers would go back dutifully and address the notes, and the studio would have their notes and say, no, change it back. We like him as a pissed off gym teacher. And I mean, it would just kind of go back and forth. And so I think, from my understanding, is that Spiner and Stewart both were heavily consulted / they had their hands on the tiller. I don't know if it's this picture or later, but they start getting executive producer credits. I mean, they actually
Insurrection. I think it starts with. Doesn't it start with Insurrection where Spiner's like
right? I mean, beyond just as an actor for hire, that they are getting input into the production process. And I think part of that was Patrick Stewart having had to play him a certain way for 7 seasons, and not, again, television back in 1994 was a lot different than it is now. I doubt that something like Andor would have lasted very long in '94. It probably would have blown away.
Right, yeah.
But he was asked to play Picard at a certain volume, at a certain level, and again, television becomes sort of like an endurance race, in the sense that you have to hit your marks and you got to get your scenes. And we just finished episode 6. Well, tomorrow we shoot episode 7. But with the film, you do get a little bit more breathing room, a little more elbow room, a little bit more room to explore. Paradoxically, you can do character development in television better, but in a film, like I say, it's kind of like, show me a different side, show me a different shading of emotion. And I think Patrick Stewart was very adamant as this thing went on that he wanted to have, a romance.
Okay.
He wanted to have the big car chase, and these were things that he, expected of the filmmakers, to work with him and deliver. So.
And didn't Spiner, didn't he say he wasn't going to come back unless was this the movie where they told him you get 3 other movies as long as you come back as Data? Because I thought he was kind of holding him for ransom at one point.
I don't remember which pictures they were, but it was sort of a tug of war, because just like it said, he'd done this for 7 years. Like, we forget,
right.
We think, wow, television's a great gig, and Kyle MacLachlan gets to play, Special Agent Dale Cooper. But I mean, as actors, like, they want to say, like, hey, I can do more than what you're asking me to do. The talking into a tape recorder and looking at trees. So I think that's the thing with Spiner, was that it's like, hey, I get, every morning I go into makeup for 3 hours and get painted gold, and it's like, I can do more than that. I can sing. I can dance. I can do, he does that crazy turn in Independence Day, very character-y turn. So I think it was always kind of a struggle behind the scenes to just make sure that there was enough for him to do as an actor, that he felt like he was getting something from the process, not just, here I am, paint me gold again. I mean, when we get into the next picture, obviously they did some things and so on and so forth. So that's the tug of war between commerce and art. It's like, how do we keep him, from just, because I mean, if he walks, then what do? Do you recast it? Do you just say, oh, Data's off on Epsilon 4, and we'll see him soon? So I mean,
the way they would bring Worf back in the movies. Like, at one point, that you don't even hear what he says, because I can't remember which movie it was, but Picard's like, oh, Mr. Worf, and then. Yeah, they kind of turn away from the camera, and it's like you don't hear the excuse that time of why he's there, which I just love that. Because he was supposed to be on DS9 or whatever.
Urza Master mentioned in the beginning, at this time, the last episode of Next Gen, All Good Things, a terrific episode, that had aired in May. That had aired in May of '94. This film came out November 18th, the week before Thanksgiving, the same year. So for fans, it was just a quick 4 or 5 months between the end of the show with Q and all of that and this movie. big screen, Jack in the Box tie-in, collectible cups, the whole thing. So, and at the same time, Deep Space Nine has been on for 2 seasons, and it's starting its 3rd as this movie is getting ready to go into theaters. And Paramount has staked a big chunk of their investment in Star Trek into launching the UPN, the United Paramount Network, and that's going to happen in January of '95, 2 months after, a month or two after this movie opens, and they're going to launch it with Voyager. That's their big flagship show. So you've got like all sorts of different permutations going on for the Star Trek fan. It's amazing. I've got multiple TV shows. I've got the big screen. I've got all this going on. Now sitting back and watching it, 30 years later, you're like you say, some of those things start to hiccup. They hadn't quite figured out how to MCU this yet and make it all seamlessly integrated. But they were trying. They were trying years before, to try and integrate film and television into a seamless narrative. So they did some growing pains, but they eventually they worked it out.
God, I miss UPN. I used to love UPN. That was one of the few channels we got, because there was a good stretch of time we didn't have TV when I was a kid, so I watched a ton of movies. But from I want to say 95 until when was it? 99? No, somewhere in there. It was 95 to maybe it was 95 to 97. We had just broadcast TV. And we live by a hill. Younger kids are not going to understand this, but when you live by a hill made of shale and limestone, broadcast TV reception blew massive donkey penis. It was not good. And we didn't have a massive antenna to bring in channels from space. We had just I think our set we had at the time didn't even have bunny ears.
Oh,
that was we were relying very heavily on good weather, and we picked up the 2 local stations with the gigantic towers and UPN. And UPN was great because Star Trek Next Generation was syndicated, so it was on all the time. Deep Space Nine was on there. I think it was every day at 4:30 or 5. It was like prime. You just got home from school, but it wasn't dinner time yet. And then Voyager was on, I think, at 7. And I think in between or right before there was Next Gen. So you were getting 3 doses of Star Trek, at least weekly, if not Next Gen every single day. And then this movie drops, or this movie had just dropped, and then the other movies start to come out. UPN was just this paradise of great sci-fi TV. This is before, I think, the Sci-Fi Channel. Not to mention the fact, I believe in the mornings from 5:30 to 7, they had anime, and they would play Dragon Ball. It would be Dragon Ball, Sailor Moon, and then they would run some other kids show, and then I think it was Sister or something. Come on. But it was a great network, and they shoved a boatload of money into this project. It's really sad it's not around today because with Paramount Plus it's kind of there, but just the magic of that time as a Star Trek fan, not to mention all the other great programming, was just intense. And getting to see some of your favorite Next Gen characters, not just in these movies, but carry on to these other series. When we get to those episodes of those shows, I'm thinking of one Voyager episode in particular that I damn near pissed myself when I watched it because it was the most unexpected. I remember when it came out because it was an unexpected character to come back for an episode of Voyager, but you get to see arguably probably the best cast female character on a Star Trek show up to that point ever. Oh God, I can't wait to talk about Voyager, you guys. I'm so excited.
Well, but I haven't seen it, so.
Oh man, it's good. It's really good. I was surprised. I remember not liking either of those shows, Deep Space Nine or Voyager, because it wasn't Next Gen. Because I was a big fan of this movie, and I just wanted more Next Gen. But now that I've gone back as an adult, I absolutely loved Deep Space Nine for a lot of reasons. But I also really love Voyager, and it's really amazing what they did with those shows, and I don't think they ever got the love in the day that they should have.
I agree with that.
Especially Voyager. So I'm really hoping that, with the renewed success of Picard, that kind of gives them an opportunity, like they're doing with the comics now. They brought back Cisco.
Cisco in the comics.
I think it'd be really cool if they do what they should do and do a Captain Worf show, and you could bring back Cisco. You could bring back a lot of those characters. I know Cole Meany was asked at some con somewhere, like, would you ever come back and do a Star Trek show? And he's like, I mean, yeah. Like, no.
Right.
So part of me is kind of like, I think, with a lot of the original series fans who watched this movie, and they were just excited to see these characters that they loved, Chekhov and Scotty and Kirk, for one last hurrah, one last go. No matter how it ended or how you felt about it, at least you got to see them one more time in those characters, because we're never going to see those characters again. Like, Kirk is not going to magically appear in Picard season 3. I would be fucking stoked if he did. Even old ass William Shatner Kirk, I would be 100% board for it.
His ego would be right behind it too to do it.
It'd be awesome.
How many warp cores do you give out of 7? How many warp cores? Let's start with Jack. Jack, how many warp cores out of 7 would you give Generations?
Oh, it's an easy 6. I mean, like I say, the minor quibbles aside, that for me, I agree with Urza Master. It's a well done picture, and I like the next gen films overall. I mean, we'll go into specifics later and so forth, but this one, I think it did what it needed to do for me. It had Spot. I mean, I'm always a sucker for a good Spot cameo there.
Yes, it did.
And Ursa mentioned this. I mean, Picard's he's not indifferent, but he doesn't have the same reverence, I guess, in terms of how he felt about a ship. I mean, it's a ship, it's a conveyance, it's something that gets from point A to point B per se. Although that flips on a dime in the next movie, but when he and Riker are cleaning out the ready room at the end, Picard to Farragut, two to beam up. Again, with the music and with the ILM shot of those ships leaving orbit and warping off to an uncertain future. I mean, it's a terrific ending. Like, even if you're feeling down, Kirk's dead, the Enterprise is wrecked, blah, blah, I still walk out of the theater with a sense of optimism, with a sense of hope, kind of like I did at the end of The Voyage Home with, NCC 1701A. I want to see what happens next. I want the next chapter to be right now, so I can see, what are they going to do? How are they going to, get out of this one?
All right, Urza, how many warp cores out of 7 do you give Generations?
It's a 7 for me. 7 warp cores, 11 out of 10 gold blooms. I give it all of my rave reviews. I love this movie. I mean, I know it's a lot of nostalgia talking, but this is the longest warp core episode we've ever done. There's a reason for that. This is probably the best of the films so far. I will say that another film we'll be talking about soon used to be my favorite, but as I've gone back and watched it as an adult, it drops from a full 7 warp cores, and this film just hasn't. So that's why it holds a solid 7 for me.
I will give it 5 out of 7.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to give it 5 out of 7 because just a couple of those things. And this is something Jack and I have talked about because, Mr. Burton over there has done a lot of writing and things like that. And just sometimes, and this is what I keep trying to tell myself, sometimes there's plot holes and you just can't fill them or there's not time, which I think Aaron brought up just excellent points with that. There's just not, it's not a season. There's not enough time to do those things. And this goes back to a conversation we had before. that's one of the things I love about Trek is they always explain everything. And now we've got a time where I'm not getting some of these things explained, and maybe that's just taking me down a little bit of a different path. So I'm going to go 5 out of 7. I still love it. I mean, it's great to watch, but yeah, the next movie we talk about, the warp cores might be a little bit higher for that one. So 5 out of 7 for this one.
Fair enough. Well, boys, we've done over an hour and a half on Star Trek 7 Generations. We have officially shifted from the original series crew to full-on next-gen crew. We get to talk about some of my favorite people in the whole wide world, especially William Riker, Deanna Troi, eventually Ensign Rowe, and I just can't wait to get through the films because I want to start talking about the shows. And I'm sure we'll have to debate where we start with the shows eventually, but want to take a second and say, again, if you have not subscribed to the Digital Escape podcast on YouTube, currently we are a YouTube exclusive podcast. We really appreciate your viewership. Love it if you could drop us a like and a comment. Let us know what you give it out of 7 warp cores. And if you're not a subscriber and this is your first time with us, please do hit that subscription button. Not only does that help us continue to deliver you top draw of Star Trek content and all the best Digital Escape podcasts and the very brand new Melt-Off podcast and soon to come, sounds like a Star Wars podcast is just coming down the pipe eventually. Which
we'll have that discussion.
Yeah, we'll talk about that offline. But we've got so many great things in the pot, so stick with us. We appreciate your time here, whether you're watching this in the morning, afternoon, we're recording in the evening. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your viewership. Thank you to Lord Uther. Thank you to our good friend Jack Burton for joining us again. And we will see you next time. Take us out.